"We're too late, buddy," the police officer warned, his expression a mask of shock and horror. "Don't go in there. Don't do it, man. That place will change you forever." Ignoring his plea, I stepped into the house. I had to. Dark red streaks painted a grim path along the floor and baseboards, leading to unseen terrors lurking in the shadows. A thick, suffocating stench enveloped me as I ventured deeper into the heart of darkness. Amidst the chaos, several horrified officers stumbled towards me, practically tripping over each other, gagging, gasping for air, and struggling to escape the nightmare unfolding before them. Every fiber of my being begged me to turn around, but duty pushed me forward. Forward, down the hallway, the trail of blood a sinister guide, leading me deeper into the abyss until finally I reached the kitchen, where the macabre journey led to its eerie conclusion, etching a scene of horror that would forever haunt the recesses of my mind. It all started with a pile of letters. Weeks had passed since the last mail had been collected in that house. A neglected pile of envelopes, browned and dusty, overflowed from the mailbox. They sat there like a forgotten message, a silent plea for attention only noticed when someone finally stumbled upon them. August 5th, 2013. "Situation unfolding at 1706 Kipling Street." Dispatch relayed urgently. "Police might require medical assistance. Concern about an elderly female who hasn't been seen in a while. Mailbox is overflowing. It's got the neighbors spooked." With that intel, we hurried to the edge of town. Neighbors disappearing for a stretch can imply numerous situations. They could be bedridden with illness, overwhelmed with work, grappling with depression, or unexpectedly away on a trip. There's usually a logical explanation. At least, that's what I kept telling myself as we made our way to Kipling, hoping for a rational explanation, not a crisis. As we pulled up, the police were already on the scene. Not just a patrol car, but a whole swarm of them. The place was crawling with cops. Worried neighbors huddled together in clusters, their faces drawn tight with concern, while grim-faced officers posed questions. The rest of the police force didn't bother with the front door. It was shut tight. Instead, they scanned the perimeter of the house, moving fast, trying to find a way in. "Whoa, that's intense," mumbled Cole, the new kid I dragged along that day. His eyes wide, taking in the scene before us. I chewed my lip, torn between explaining and keeping him focused. "Let's just say today might be a bit more." I trailed off, searching for the right words. "Unconventional," finally slipped out. Newbies had to be eased into chaos, not overwhelmed by it. "Second floor windows wide open. Looks like nobody bothered with a break-in." Cole and I stepped out of the ambulance as we observed officers hauling themselves onto the porch roof. The open window in itself was a question mark. Someone entering through an unlocked window like that could explain why the lady wasn't around. The three officers scrambled through the opening, disappearing into the house. That's around the time when Cole and I approached the overflowing mailbox, as another officer flipped through the letters with a frown. Each one sported the same return address. His voice dipped low, laced with a hint of unease. "Seems Mrs. Henderson had someone else worried sick before we even got here." I knelt beside the mailbox, taking in the full picture. Letters crammed every available space, some ripped and crumpled, others spilling onto the ground. It wasn't just overflowing, it was a mess, as if someone had shoved the letters in with a desperate urgency, and all of them felt left unanswered. An unsettling quiet blanketed the scene as I idled back to the ambulance, running a mental inventory of our supplies. The monotony of the identical houses lining the street was almost eerie, despite the tension brewing. Each perfect lawn and manicured hedge mirrored the one beside it. Even the residents seamlessly blended together, all rocking their signature look of polo shirts, khaki shorts, and boat shoes, as if perfectly tailored for this idyllic portrait of suburban splendor. Here, on a Saturday, a fact gleaned not from the calendar, but from the symphony of lawnmowers and hedge trimmers humming in unison. A few curious residents had gathered. Cops and medics swarming a single house were a rare sight on this uniform block, a stark contrast to that predictable neighborhood routine. According to snippets I overheard from the cops talking to neighbors, Mrs. Henderson had lived alone since moving to Kipling 7 years ago. A recluse, she rarely left the house. Yet, somehow she'd become a familiar figure in the neighborhood. Apparently, her son used to visit frequently, sometimes staying overnight, but lately, arguments had become a regular occurrence whenever he was around. The last time anyone saw Mrs. Henderson, a neighbor recounted her kicking her son out. "There!" Cole suddenly barked, his voice tight with urgency, his finger jabbing towards the window through which the police had entered earlier. We followed his gaze, a collective breath catching in our throats. A skeletal feline clung precariously to the side of Mrs. Henderson's house. A stomach-churning stench filled the air, a vile cocktail of decay and filth. The creature descended with a frantic grace, its movements jagged and unpredictable, as it emitted a cry upon losing its grip. Inch by inch down the pristine white siding it crept, leaving a horrifying dark red streak in its wake. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Officers surged forward, but the cat was a blur of panicked fur. It darted beneath a nearby hedge, vanishing into the tangled undergrowth before they could even reach for it. Despite the escape, the evidence remained stark and horrifying. The red trail marred the previously immaculate siding, a grotesque reminder of the feline's bloody trespass. "That's one of her cats!" A woman shrieked, her voice cracking with a mix of terror and morbid fascination, perhaps. The grim suspicion that had etched lines on the officers' faces moments ago had morphed into a chilling certainty. The trail, a sickening smear of crimson staining the pristine siding, spoke volumes. The acrid stench, thick and foul, sent shivers through the crowd. Restlessness spread among the bystanders, underlining the horror unfolding before them. Concern flickered in some eyes for the scrawny cat, its desperate escape leaving a gruesome signature on the house. But fear quickly eclipsed it. That trail, a chilling echo of violence, left everyone wondering what horrors unfolded inside. The veneer of calm outside 1706 Kipling Street shattered. A growing unease, fueled by hushed whispers and furtive glances, escalated into a chaotic symphony. From within the house, windows flew open with violence. A flurry of movement, sleek, panicked shapes erupted from the house, leaving crimson streaks across the pristine siding. More cats, with blood as their trails. Then the front door burst open. 3 figures stumbled out. One officer half-dragged another, his face a mask of nausea and raw primal terror. The third, pale as death, pressed his palm over his mouth, muffling violent, dry heaves. These were hardened men, accustomed to the grim realities of their job. Yet, etched on their faces was a level of abject fear. "Don't go in there!" The seemingly composed officer barked, his voice hoarse with urgency. "It's not worth it." My gaze darted to his arm, a fresh set of scratches marring his skin. The scene outside the house took a horrifying turn. A couple more cats had just darted from those windows out of the house only seconds ago. Each one a skeletal, fur-matted, dull. They looked less like living creatures and more like harbingers of something unspeakable. The silence returned, heavier, thicker, suffocating. broken only by the ragged gasps of the officers recovering from their ordeal. A determined sergeant took charge, barking orders as he strode confidently towards the front door. Some officers followed closely behind. However, as one of them approached, he stumbled back, dry heaving, and eventually retreated from the doorway, perhaps due to the ominous stench emanating from within. "Jesus," he gasped. "Something definitely died in there." Moments later, a panicked hand thrust out from the doorway, seeking our attention. It was an officer, barely visible in the darkness, signaling the urgent need for access, but with a clear instruction. Medical supplies were to be left behind. Confusion etched across our faces as Cole and I exchanged a concerned glance. Outside, yellow police tape now barricaded the entrance, a venomous warning contrasting sharply with the urgency emanating from within. Swallowing hard, I abandoned my trusty medical bag in favor of a fresh face mask, the first defense against the noxious stench already assaulting my senses. With determined resolve, we ducked under the cautionary tape and stepped into the house, where Cole's typically steady demeanor wavered, replaced by a palpable restlessness. The threshold assaulted our senses. Thick, undisturbed dust blanketed every surface like a shroud. Torn wallpaper hung in ragged tatters, its patterns obscured by layers of grime. A feral stench clawed at our throats, a sickening blend of stale cat urine and something more sinister. The once plush carpet felt damp and uneven beneath our feet, the overpowering sweetness of vomit clinging to our shoes. Upon closer inspection, the culprit emerged, a viscous puddle of dried milk, crusted and discolored, surrounded by a disturbing halo of fur. But it was the unnatural stillness that unsettled me. The air, thick with the scent of decay, held no hint of movement, no rustle of life. Only as our eyes adjusted to the gloom did we see the source of it all. Scattered across the floor, amidst the debris and filth, lay the bodies of several dead cats, blood on their mouths. The sergeant in charge nodded towards the kitchen, indicating with a subtle movement of his head. As we followed the dark, red trail of blood snaking across the floors, tracing along baseboards and walls, police officers hurried past us, their urgent movements hinting at the gravity of the situation within. Standing in the hallway, the sergeant informed us that he had documented everything visible from the doorway, but suggested we investigate further to confirm if anything remained alive. "Just protocol," he added, a touch of solemnity in his tone. Unspoken, but unmistakable. It was evident that despite his tough exterior, he lacked the resolve to enter the kitchen himself. Perhaps unwilling to reveal his vulnerability, he deferred the task to us. Additionally, his colleagues seemed to recoil in discomfort merely by proximity, hinting at the severity of the situation within. "Pretty sure whatever's in there is deceased, right? Medics don't handle the dead, do they?" Cole stammered, tinged with desperation. "Not typically," I replied, my stomach churning. It was more than a welfare check. Entering the kitchen, the scene unfolded in its horrifying entirety. In the center lay Mrs. Henderson, a grotesque shadow of her former self. It was a massacre, her flesh desiccated and mottled, hung loosely from her skeletal frame, a result of weeks of decomposition. But it wasn't her decayed state that gave me the creeps. As I approached, I noticed the most disturbing detail. Several of her fingers, her ears and nose, and even a whole foot were missing, gnawed clean from the body. The suspicion in my gut solidified as I saw remains of flesh lodged between the cat's teeth, matching the ghastly wounds on Mrs. Henderson's corpse. The neighbors called her the crazy cat lady. Her love for them took a dark turn when she was no longer able to let them out and the kibble bowl ran dry. The devastated state of her body offered no clear answers, at least not to a paramedic. The involvement of a medical examiner was necessary to untangle the timeline and cause of her death. In any case, the cats provided a grim explanation for the missing appendages, perhaps a desperate act of survival in the face of starvation. Yet the true how and why remained shrouded in a disturbing fog. Cole. A flicker of memory sparked but quickly faded. Had he even been there with me when we entered the kitchen? Outside, a hand clamped down on my shoulder, jolting me back to an awareness of the present. "Hey," a gruff voice said, the cop's face etched with concern. "You've been writing in that notebook for a good 10 minutes. You all right?" His words pierced the fog, a sharp reminder of where I was, of what I'd witnessed. Numbness receded, replaced by a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. This wasn't a scene for paramedics. The dead needed no medical attention. Weeks bled into one another. Back at the station, Mrs. Henderson's case became a dark punchline. The cats ate the crazy cat lady. But the real sting wasn't the morbid humor. It was the effect on Kipling. Whispers of curses and demonic possession spread faster than the stench from the house. People used the tragedy as a morbid anecdote, a cautionary tale blown out of proportion. A court hearing revealed whispers of Mrs. Henderson's heart troubles, some believing cats soothed such ailments. Perhaps a heart attack claimed her, leaving her feline companions to fend for themselves for weeks. The post-mortem confirmed chronic obstructive pulmonary disease as the likely culprit. A lonely death, a grim act of survival. In the end, the overflowing mailbox was the only record of a life lived in quiet isolation. A life ultimately devoured by silence, not by cats.